COVID-19 Ministerial Committee co-chair, Professor Koleka Mlisana, has welcomed President Cyril Ramaphosa's suggestion that vaccination may become mandatory to access some public spaces. The president last night revealing that a task team has been set up to explore the issue as the Omicron variant spreads globally. Mlisana says vaccine education is vital.
As he mentioned very clearly, and I think every South African is now aware, that really if we are going to make an impact and be able to live with this pandemic, live with SARS-CoV-2, we need to do a few things, and we need to do those, almost 100%. And as we know, firstly, it becomes, the NPIs, social, public health and social measures. We need to stick to that. And then the main one becomes vaccination. And as he overemphasized last night, the importance of vaccination. Now, the challenge as a country that we have had insofar as vaccination is concerned is that we no longer have a problem with supplies. We've got, in fact, more than enough vaccines. We no longer have a challenge with vaccination sites. So, the sites are there. They are almost empty, most of them. What we really are in short of is people coming in for vaccination. Now, to get people to come in for vaccination, there has been a lot that we are all aware of negative talks, all the conspiracy theories. So there's an element of education that is required, and you can never educate, communities enough. But over and above that, I think, as Dr. Dasu says, I fully agree with him. I think we've come to a point now where a lot of means have been done to get people to come to vaccinate.
Well, let's discuss whether the country's laws would allow such a policy. We're joined by Wits University public health lawyer Safura Abdul Karim and Stellenbosch University Center for Medical Ethics and Law Director Professor Keymanthri Moodley. Good evening to both of you, and thank you so much for your time. Professor Moodley, let me perhaps begin with you. Let's talk about the difference, if there is any, between vaccine mandate and compulsory vaccinations.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. So the words mandatory and compulsory are very similar in nature, so I don't think there is a need to distinguish between them at this point in time. It's more important to fully understand what mandatory vaccine policies entail and why they are so important during this pandemic.
Let's talk then about mandatory vaccinations and exactly your question, what does it mean for a country like South Africa right now?
I think the recent variant has shown us that when we have a large population of unvaccinated people, the probability of variants developing is extremely high. And so the current recognition of a variant has made it imperative that a vaccine mandate is introduced in South Africa. We've been discussing this in South Africa since August of this year, so it's been several months of debate and discussion, and we've sort of run out of time to discuss it any further. The current impact of this new variant makes it imperative to improve vaccine uptake as soon as possible. And we know that vaccine mandates can increase uptake of vaccines by around 18 to 20%, which is a substantial difference and will take us from a third of the adult population being vaccinated to at least half if we implement these vaccines rather quickly.
Safura, when we look at the responses that we have in the country right now, government very much towing the line, saying it's consulting on the issue. We've had some businesses that have been very clear by issuing even deadlines for when they're giving workers an opportunity to be vaccinated, including universities. Is South African law as unclear about the issue as vaccine mandates as one would think, looking at the varying responses across multiple sectors?
So I think there are two issues. The one is a vaccine mandate can really look a number of different ways. it can range from forcing somebody to take a vaccine without their consent, all the way through to preventing somebody from going to a restaurant if they're not vaccinated, or not allowing them to work in a client or customer-facing role. So that range gives you an additional sense of the spectrum of legality and the spectrum of constitutionality of these different measures. We know that under South African law, even the most extreme example I described is permitted under our law. And we've seen it used in the case of compelled isolation for extremely drug-resistant TB. We've seen a population-level mandate through the use of the yellow fever passports. So we know that our law can accommodate a different type of vaccine mandate. But as you've pointed out, so many different people have adopted vaccine mandates in different ways that our approach has become rather ad hoc. And now these policies are being tested through the court system to test their constitutionality. And that wide variance is going to even muddy the waters further. We're still not clear on what types of mandates exactly are constitutional. So there is a huge benefit in the government taking an approach that's consistent for everyone and creating a level of certainty in what is quite an ad hoc environment at the moment.
I want to explore that issue further, because ultimately when it comes to the people who are saying, I don't want to be forced by government to take the vaccine, and that is my constitutional right, and my wanting to be within the limitations of my rights should not impede on anybody else who wants to get vaccinated. Is there a clear answer legally for people who have that as their argument?
So I think there are two aspects to it again. The one is there is no right in the Constitution that is unlimited. We frequently say as lawyers, even the right to life is limited. So we have to understand and approach it from that perspective, which is everybody's rights can be limited if there is a good enough reason to justify that limitation, which then goes to the second issue, which is when somebody chooses not to be vaccinated, they do not pose a risk solely to themselves. They actually pose a risk to our community, not only because unvaccinated individuals pose a very heavy burden on the healthcare system that prevents other people from utilizing it, but also because they are more likely to transmit the virus, they are much more infectious than other people. And so for that reason, there really is a broader effect from choosing not to be vaccinated. And in that way, you are, in exercising that choice, limiting the rights of others, which is why in the Balancing Act, it does come out slightly more on the side of public health. And we've seen through the past 2 years that the courts have time and time again weighted that public health consideration, that broader community right to healthcare, that broader community to life, much heavier than these individual limitations. I will say this, vaccine mandates are much more invasive than the things that have been tested in our courts, but it gives us an indication.
Let me bring you in here, Professor Moodley, because there are moral and ethical considerations here. Tell us about what some of those are.
So once again, similar to the legal explanation that you have from Safura, from an ethics perspective, there's also a balancing act between individual rights and the common good or the public interest. And so from an ethical perspective, during a pandemic such as this, which is a public health emergency, we use an ethics framework that is grounded in public health ethics. And using this approach, it's often important that public health and community interests override individual interests for the good of all. And so from an ethics perspective, a mandate would be justifiable using a public health ethics framework. The United Nations in 1985 also established a set of principles referred to as the Syracuse Principles, which allow for limitation of rights under specific conditions, and a public health emergency would justify a limitation of rights under these principles as well.
Safura, when we look at what the reaction has been from, again, different sectors, we've got business that's planning on going to court in the early parts of next year, seeking a declaratory order around these vaccine mandates. That's if, of course, government doesn't announce anything clear going forward. We also have, on the other hand, when it comes to these vaccine mandates, political parties that are expressing differing views. There is currently a view from some political parties that this matter has to be sent back to Parliament and let Parliament be the body that ultimately decides on this issue. Do you think that that is the way to go here?
So, South Africans have been living with the State of Disaster Act for almost 2 years now, and we've become used to this idea of a minister and a president sort of making some speeches, and all of a sudden, whoop, our life has changed. And there's a problem with that. In a democracy where Parliament is our democratically elected representatives, they've had very little role to play in the governance of this pandemic. It also is that Parliament is given much, much wider and stronger powers. So when Parliament limits rights, it's treated slightly differently to when it happens through a regulation or policy that's affected by the executive. So it's quite a compelling basis to send it to Parliament. But here's the big but that is applicable in public health emergencies. Time is of the essence. We are facing a fourth wave with a terrible new variant. We need decisive action on this issue. We need clarity on it now, not in a year's time, not in 8 months' time. We need it now. We've seen how quickly we can ban alcohol sales. We've seen how quickly we can ban tobacco products. Let's see how quickly government can move on what is really a critical public health intervention at this time. So my suggestion is, it would be nice if Parliament could look at it, but really we need decisive action, and here expediency matters.
Let's leave it there for tonight. Professor Keymanthri Moodley from Stellenbosch University and Safura Abdul Karim, and she's with the University of the Witwatersrand.